Up next, we have Raphael Roettgen, and he is the Managing Director of E2MC Ventures. He'll be speaking on innovation in the global space sector and the need for private investment. And this session will be moderated by Rico Pang.
So without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Raphael, from the E2MC Ventures. Raphael is the Managing Director, and they have been working a lot in the global space sector. And we have spoken before in the last DPEC forum. And this time around, we should be speaking a lot more on the need for private investment. As we are all aware, capital is always very important in the incubation and accelerating tech businesses. And with further ado, Raphael, the stage is yours. Please feel free to share with us your latest innovation in the space sector, and what are your pointers in the private investment strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rico, and it's a pleasure to be back here at Deep Tech Forum. So let me share my screen without any further ado, as you mentioned. Over here. I hope you can see that. Okay, terrific. Yeah, so this is just going to be a very quick overview, reminding ourselves what's going on in the space sector, and then how can we arrange the financing for these important activities for humanity. I think you already given the introduction of myself. My main job is basically being a space venture capitalist through something called E2MC Ventures, which is an early stage investor in space companies worldwide. And I'm also quite active in space outreach and education. I have a podcast called the Space Business Podcast and a few online courses about space business, which people can look up online under my name. This is the podcast. Right, so just to remind ourselves, space, why is this such an interesting moment in space? And really at the root of it is the picture here on the left. Many of you will recognize this is SpaceX Falcon boosters landing back on Earth. This is actually from a Falcon Heavy launch, so it's the two side boosters landing back. Actually, the central booster usually also comes back. So all three first stages of that rocket are reused, and that's just very different from what happened in the past when we basically threw away entire rockets. And as you can imagine, not throwing away even part of a rocket, it saves a lot of money. And that really, of course, started it all sort of in the recent years, because it has helped to bring down the cost of space transportation dramatically. So, if we look at something like taking 1 kilogram of mass to what we call a low Earth orbit, until a few years ago, even on a big rocket, you would have probably looked at least $10,000 for 1 kilogram to low Earth orbit. And SpaceX, it's less than 3,000 if you take the entire rocket. If you do what's called a ride share, it's about 5,000. And importantly, with SpaceX's next generation rocket, the Starship, which many people will be aware of, that they're testing right now in Texas, this may drop by another order of magnitude or more. So getting to space is much cheaper, but that's not the only thing that's getting cheaper. Actually, operating in space is also getting much cheaper. And that's got to do with things that all of the costs of space components, and including entire satellites, are dropping dramatically as well. And this is sort of a combination of general technological trends, things dropping, along curves like Moore's law, as well as a consequence of the fact that we're in space moving from low unit numbers to higher unit numbers. Like we used to make very few satellites, now we're making many more satellites. And of course that produces economies of scale. So the bottom line is space is getting much cheaper. And the consequence of that is that suddenly means a lot more business models are economically viable to execute in space, which were not economically viable before. I mean, the old prejudice, or one of the old prejudices against space is it's extremely expensive. It's only for governments. But that really has been changing the last few years, and it will continue to change in this direction. And this is why you have now here the last point on this slide, these projections that the space economy will grow to trillion or trillions of dollars over the next few years. The most recent one, I think, was a report by Citibank out just a couple of days ago, which projecting $1 trillion by 2040 in global revenues. Right, so that's a reminder of the big trends to set the stage. A reminder of what is actually going on in space in terms of business models. So this is an infographic we developed at my fund to kind of make it easy to give people an overview. And if we start here on Earth, there's some things which are basically happening that are starting in Earth, like, for example, launching rockets. You have companies whose business it is to launch rockets, like parts of SpaceX, that's their business, right? Or companies like Rocket Lab from New Zealand. You have people who build satellites or parts of satellites. You have people who analyze satellite data. So they don't actually have to go to space. They just buy the satellite data, but analyze it here on Earth with data scientists. And you have what's called a ground segment as well, excuse me, here on Earth. So in order to communicate with satellites and get the data back, you need ground stations. And that's another business that exists here on Earth. If we now move towards orbit, we have a number of business models which have been around for a while. And that includes, for example, satellite communications. I mean, traditionally, that's been mostly satellite TV, but now we're increasingly having satellite internet, satellite broadband connectivity. We have what's called remote sensing, or sometimes Earth observation. Remote sensing is the more general term. So that's basically exactly what the name says. It's observing the Earth with some type of sensor. It could be an optical camera, but it could also be infrared or what we call hyperspectral, or an active sensor like radar. And all of these different sensors can provide us with different insights about what's going on Earth. And that has traditionally had use cases primarily for national security and weather, but now we're discovering more and more use cases like agriculture, like other things, insurance, oil and gas, metals and mining. Almost any terrestrial sector you can think of can benefit from satellite imagery. Satellite navigation, everybody will be familiar with in their daily lives. And that's, of course, a very important business as well. So these three businesses, satellite communications, remote sensing, navigation, have been around for a while, have been known for a while. But then we also have the newer businesses like space tourism. And many of you will have followed the number of sort of private space missions that have been taking place over the last couple of years. Most recently, a mission called Axiom 1 that took 3 paying passengers to International Space Station. They paid $55 million each to go on a SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule, and then was meant to spend 10 days on the International Space Station. But luckily for them, there was weather delays, so they actually got more time. We have space stations, and there's a number of space stations now being built and proposed, and those can be used for a number of purposes. Again, it could be used for tourism, but it could also be used for things like in-space manufacturing. And this actually makes sense to manufacture certain things in space, taking advantage of the microgravity conditions. And there's a number of examples which we've known for a while because we've done experiments in space for a long time. But again, these things were never economically viable to exploit for businesses, but now they become economically viable. So, and this includes potential products like optical fibers, certain biological materials, certain other types of advanced materials, including advanced semiconductors. We have a number of what we call orbit services, in-space services, and that's really a range of things. It includes things like refueling in space, removing space debris, taking you from one location in space to another via what we call space tugs. And these businesses are also right now slowly coming online. Then if you move further away from Earth, the moon is starting to get interesting. And there's actually a large number of at least robotic missions planned to the moon starting later this year. And then, of course, even crewed missions. So NASA has the so-called Artemis missions, which were originally meant to land the next astronauts in 2024. I think now the consensus is that's going to be pushed out at least a couple of years or so. But humans are returning to the moon, and people are starting to think about what kind of businesses could we actually have on the moon. Again, it could be things like tourism, but it could also be things like using the resources present on the moon, including there's a large amount of water on the moon in the form of ice that we now know about. And then you go out from there and you go towards Mars and the asteroid belt, but that's of course further in the future. So that's just a reminder first of the trends and then of the kind of businesses we have in space. Now, if you look at the financing side, so there's of course many exciting things to do here, but they cost money. One important thing that I want to point out here is, again, there's been this historical stereotype that everything in space is horrifically expensive. And that's actually not true. There's a range of activities, right? So if we start on the left here, of course, there are some things which literally require investment in the billions of dollars, like large constellations of satellites like SpaceX is doing with their Starlink internet constellation, big space stations, large rockets like SpaceX's Starship. Lunar activities can be very expensive. So you're more towards the billions of dollars. Then you have some activities like here in the middle, which are probably more in the hundreds of millions. Smaller rockets, satellite ground stations, some in-orbit activities. That spider-like spacecraft you see here in the middle on the lower left, that's actually a spacecraft that's built to remove large pieces of space debris. It's a robotic autonomous spacecraft. And the total financing need there is probably in the hundreds of millions rather than the billions. But then interestingly, there's business models which even need much less money. And so if you go to the right, those are just a couple of satellite images, right? On the top image is of basically an oil storage facility. And why would you want to observe that? Well, maybe you're an oil trader. You want to understand what's the inventory level in that oil storage facility. And then the lower picture is an image that's a national security example. That's an image of Pyongyang in North Korea, which probably the only way to observe Pyongyang is via satellite for quite obvious reasons. So the reason I put this here in the lower capital intensive category is because there's a range of businesses you can imagine now on Earth that take advantage of the increasing amount of satellite imagery we have, because there's already a number of imaging satellites in orbit, and a lot more are going up over the next few years. So we have a lot of imagery from orbit. And again, different types of sensors, optical, infrared, hyperspectral, radar, which are, each type of sensor is well suited to specific use cases. But that means we can take this data and we can start really analyzing it in value added ways for certain customer industries on Earth. But perceive that for this type of business model, if you don't own your own satellites, it's not very capital intensive at all. You effectively have a space business, but your biggest cost is basically, is OpEx. You spend OpEx on computing time through AWS or Azure or something, and then basically hiring a bunch of data scientists. So it's a long way away from the billions of dollars that you can spend on other space business models. So just keep that in mind, that there's a range of business models in space. In terms of sources of funding, one way you can divide it is just public sources of funding and private sources of funding. On the public side, it can come from space agencies. Also very important, always has been in space, is the military as well as the intelligence community, especially in countries like the US or China for that sake. You could have development agencies in certain countries. On the private side, it's basically all of the sort of typical sources of funding for companies, ranging from angels, smaller angel checks. We even now have crowdfunding in space. I'm on the investment committee of something called Spaced Ventures in the US, which is a purely space-focused crowdfunding platform, which has now already raised money for several companies. Of course, traditional VCs, including specialist VCs like my own E2MC, corporate VCs, for example, from aerospace companies like Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed, all have VC arms investing in space companies. Bigger financial institutions like hedge funds or private equity funds, especially for later stage rounds, and a lot of them have started to get involved in space. And of course, the public markets, the stock exchanges, right? And there we've seen a lot of activity the last 18 months or so, and a lot of that in the form of mergers with SPACs, which of course is controversial, but quite a few transactions have gotten done with more or less success, which I think I have a separate slide on. Different investors, I'm not going to go through this in detail. Different investors have different characteristics in terms of coming in at the various stages and different industry knowledge. Just to point out, there is a lot of money available for space. So this is examples from 2021. Of course, we have to see how this now plays out, space funding rounds or generally venture funding rounds right now, the next 2 or 3 months. Of course, the market environment is now different from a few months ago. But certainly last year, we've had some very large rounds. I mean, SpaceX raised several times for a total of $1 billion. OneWeb, which is another broadband communications constellation, almost raised $2 billion over several rounds, and many rounds in the hundreds of millions of dollars for some of these more capital intensive business models, as I explained on a previous slide. And then I mentioned the SPACs, and this is probably hard to read, but it's just to make the point that there were over a dozen mergers between SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies, and space companies, taking those companies public via the SPAC merger, right? And in the process, raising money for the space companies, right? Because the SPACs obviously have cash in the trust as well. Typically, you have additional investors which come in at the time of the merger, so-called pipe investors. Now, this route of financing is probably almost certainly temporarily closed because of a lot of the SPACs have been performing very poorly. But SPACs have been around for decades. Actually, some people are not aware of that, and there's always these cycles. And I'm actually quite convinced that SPACs will come back, probably in a better shape, in a better regulated shape, within a certain time frame, and we will see more of these transactions. Probably not in the next few months. I don't think that's very realistic, unless what we may still see is sort of the back end of the previous SPAC boom, because there's still a lot of SPACs out there which are looking for merger candidates, and it's possible that some of them may end up merging with a space company. but it will not raise as much cash as was raised before in these transactions. And here, this is driving the point home also public markets. This is not even updated for the most recent sort of leg down. But here we have an internally developed space index, which is in red, and then the NASDAQ in blue and the S&P in green. And you could see that towards the end of 2020, the space index really started outperforming quite dramatically. And that's also when the SPAC transaction started to happen. But then sort of beginning of sort of second half of last year, the space index outperformance was basically all given back, and you kind of ended up back to where the S&P was. If we extended this to today, you'd probably even see some underperformance of the space index, I would imagine, which may mean it for selected space companies, it may be an interesting entry point, but certainly not for all. To finish up here, I think it's important to point out some space-specific challenges that we hear a lot from generalist investors. And I say we, when my own fund, we obviously go fundraising as well, right, from family offices and other people. And what are some of the things we often hear and how can we respond to them? Well, one point is, well, it's a deep tech industry and that's intimidating. It's literally rocket science, right? Often we say it's not rocket science, but this is rocket science. Well, then, of course, my self-serving response is that's true. That's why you should outsource to specialist investors like myself or another fund like ours. Another sort of critique or concern is, which I mentioned before, is people think that all of the business models are very capital intensive, need a lot of money. You've already seen my response that there's a wide range here actually, and some business models are actually not capital intensive. So you can construct a portfolio that's a mix. Related to that, the third bullet point is some people concerned, well, isn't it a really long time frame? Don't space projects take years and years and years until you see revenue and let alone profits and cash flows? And again, the answer is, well, it really depends on the business model, and you construct a portfolio that's a mix. And then the last concern is that, well, where are the success stories? You know, where are the exits? Where are the wealthy entrepreneurs? And that was true until maybe a couple of years ago, but now we actually have examples. Some of the SPAC mergers, even after the stock prices came down, at least earlier investors came away with good returns. We actually have some other types of strategic exits as well, like trade sales to larger companies and so forth. So we're starting to see exits. So that point is also being worked on. What I think is key here is, so we need more money for space. I think two suggestions I have, we need to bring in public money in a smart way. The US does a very good job in that. And we need to educate generalist investors about space, what's going on in space, how you can allocate to space. And that's where events like Deep Tech Forum are, of course, can be really helpful in this investor education. And then the very last point I like to make, partly because I'm sitting in Switzerland and we care a lot about impact investing, I really think a lot of space is actually impact investing. Because, you know, the only way we actually know about climate change, we can observe climate change, is through satellites, essentially, right? But that's just one example. You could also say like satellite communications allows us to connect people who were previously not connected, which allows things like remote education. There's just an announcement. Elon Musk was just in Brazil and announced he's connecting. I think it was 19,000 schools and like the remote Amazon via Starlink. So there's a lot of examples of how spaces impact investing. So this is also something I'd like to keep in people's minds. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop here, but hopefully this was a useful overview.
Thank you very much, Raphael. Are you good for one question from the crowd?
Yes.
Great. So what is the estimated investment, that will be needed to launch in some products into a space like right now compared to like say 15 years ago?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You can actually look at it in first, if you just look at it in terms of mass, right? So if you go on a SpaceX rideshare right now, as I said, and you go to what we call a low Earth orbit, you basically pay $5,000, right? So if you have like a 3-kilogram satellite, simplistically speaking, you pay like $15,000, right? Of course, there's some other costs outside the launch, right, for integration and everything. But purely in terms of launch costs, let's say $5,000 a kilogram. And then, 10, 15 years ago, that would have been at least 10, but probably much more, because it would have been difficult to even just, also logistically, to just launch one small satellite. But that's not all of it, right? Because you have the other technological changes that happened at the same time, things getting cheaper and things getting smaller. I haven't even talked about this, but as in many parts of technology, we have miniaturization, right? That like the same capability right now is much smaller than it was 10 years ago, or even just a few years ago, right? Think about how much more powerful your cell phones get with every generation, right? Because components get smaller. But because size is correlated typically with mass, right, that means actually the cost of taking a certain capability to space has fallen much, much more. And there's certain examples you could show, like a certain type of remote sensing satellite with a certain capability of resolution that you could now, including the launch, costs maybe $1 million. 20 years ago, it would have been $100 million. So that's the kind of like 2 orders of magnitude. That's the type of change.
So it's almost 100x cheaper now.
Yeah, for certain examples here, that's the kind of magnitude you're talking about. It's like 2 magnitudes type order.
That's awesome. So Raphael, thank you very much for coming back to a data from this year. And I have good news to share with you later on. I will inform you when our Deep Tech Impact Fund is launched shortly, and definitely a lot of synergies we can explore to build more ventures and unicorns in the space industry. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rico.
Yeah. Bye.